At 4:12 station time, 3rd Communications Officer Rel Advash noticed that the human relay had stopped humming. It was a small thing. The relay sat in a rack 2 decks below the council listening post, one blinking light among 4,000 others. And in 6 years of monitoring it, Rel had never once seen it go dark outside of scheduled maintenance. She checked the schedule. No maintenance was logged. She pinged the relay directly and got nothing back, not even the polite, automated apology human systems usually sent when they were busy. She tried the next relay down the chain. Also silent. She tried the embassy line, the trade line, the diplomatic hotline that connected the Council's Central Assembly to the human systems of Sol and its 11 colonies, the emergency channel, that had never once in 40 years failed to answer within 90 seconds. Nothing answered at all. By 4:40, she had escalated at 3 levels up her chain of command, and by 5:15 an undersecretary with silver-threaded skin and the tired eyes of someone who had been woken from actual sleep was standing over her shoulder asking her to run the diagnostic a 4th time, as if the problem might have fixed itself out of embarrassment. It had not fixed itself. Every channel that led toward human space, public or private, civilian or military, had gone quiet at the same moment, as if someone had reached out and switched off a light. Could it be an attack? The undersecretary asked. Something hit their relay network. Rel shook her head. An attack takes down infrastructure unevenly. This was even. Every channel, same second, clean shutdown. This wasn't done to them. She looked up. This was done by them. The undersecretary did not understand what that meant yet. Nobody did, not fully, not for another 6 hours. When the Council Central Assembly convened an emergency session, and the human delegate's seat sat empty for the first time since humanity had been granted provisional membership 31 years earlier, and the small brass nameplate that had always read Ambassador of SOL and Colonies had been quietly removed sometime in the night, leaving a clean rectangle of unfaded wood where it used to be. To understand why the light had gone out, the Assembly first had to reconstruct, in the space of one badly organized morning, everything it had spent 3 decades not paying close attention to. Humanity had joined the Council the way a lot of newer species did. Hopeful, a little overeager, carrying gifts nobody had asked for and asking questions nobody wanted to answer. They had arrived with fusion drives the Council found charmingly primitive and medicine the Council found startlingly effective, with an appetite for treaties and a matching appetite for arguing about the fine print of those treaties, and with a cultural output, films, music, food, games, the strange human habit of turning grief and joy alike into something you could sell tickets to, that had, against every prediction, spread through a dozen client systems within a decade. The older species on the Council found this alarming for reasons they rarely said aloud. A species with no ascension, no great cycle, no epic-spanning philosophy to justify its behavior had simply shown up, still evolving in real time, still arguing among itself about basic things, and had nonetheless started shaping how a meaningful fraction of the galaxy ate dinner and fell in love and told stories about both. That was not supposed to happen to a species 400 years removed from its first satellite. So the Council did what it always did with things it found alarming. It regulated them. It began gently, trade tariffs justified as developmental balancing, a seat on the Assembly but no seat on the steering committee, a permanent designation as emerging species, Category 2, that came with a permanent set of restrictions nobody bothered explaining, because it had never occurred to anyone that a Category 2 species would ask why. Humans asked why constantly. The Council found this exhausting, and in the closed sessions, humans were not permitted to attend. Said so. Over the years, the restrictions accumulated the way sediment does, one thin layer at a time, until nobody currently serving on the Council could remember a version of the relationship that hadn't been built on the assumption that humanity needed managing. Human weapons technology was capped, for the stated reason of galactic stability. Though everyone privately understood that a species this young building anything more advanced made several older species nervous in a way they preferred not to examine. Human colonization rights were limited to a shrinking list of designated developmental zones. Human representatives on joint committees were routinely seated last, spoken over first, and reminded. Kindly, always kindly. The council was never anything but kind about it. That patience was a virtue younger species had yet to fully cultivate. Humanity, for its part, had spent 31 years being patient. It kept showing up to sessions. It kept sending its brightest people to sit through hearings that treated them like gifted children who might, with enough correction, eventually grow into something the adults could take seriously. It kept its complaints polite and its objections in writing and its anger, when it had any, mostly off the record. The final vote had been about art. It sounded absurd when Rel first heard the summary, and she said so out loud, and the undersecretary did not disagree. The Cultural Standards Subcommittee, a body that existed mostly to catalog things and had never before, in living memory, ruled on anything more consequential than the labeling requirements for imported textiles, had spent 4 months reviewing a petition from 3 older member species complaining that unregulated human media was producing measurable destabilization in their younger populations. Complaint after complaint had cited the same handful of things. Young aliens on a dozen worlds staying up too late watching human dramas with endings that refused to resolve neatly, humming songs in a language that wasn't theirs, arguing with elders about ideas that had entered their heads from books written by a species with no ascension and no business, apparently, having opinions the council considered worth spreading. The subcommittee's ruling came down on a Tuesday. Effective immediately, human origin cultural exports, music, film, literature, cuisine, and associated unregulated ideation required council pre-approval before distribution outside human space. Existing distribution agreements were suspended pending review. The human delegate, a soft-spoken career diplomat named Aisha Idowu, who had spent 11 years building the relationships that made those distribution agreements possible in the first place, was not consulted before the vote and was informed of the outcome via the same automated notice sent to every other affected party. She read it twice at her desk. Then she stood up, walked down the corridor to the assembly floor, and requested 5 minutes to address the full body, which was granted, mostly out of habit, because nobody expected her to say anything that mattered. Nobody who was in the chamber that day could later agree on exactly what she said. The transcript, once it was finally released weeks later, showed it ran 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and was almost entirely without anger. She thanked the council for 31 years of partnership. She noted, without elaborating, that humanity had learned everything it needed to learn about what the council actually thought of it, and that the lesson had taken longer to land than it should have. She said that a people who had to ask permission to sing were not being protected, they were being managed, and that humanity had decided it no longer wished to be managed by people who had never once, in 3 decades, asked what humanity actually wanted. Then she said humanity was withdrawing from the council, effective at midnight Seoul Standard Time, and that all official channels would close at the same moment. She did not threaten anyone. She did not raise her voice. She thanked the chamber again, gathered her notes, and left. Most of the delegates present assumed it was a negotiating tactic. Ambassadors postured all the time. Walkouts were practically a genre of diplomacy, a way of extracting concessions by threatening to leave and then not actually leaving. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody thought they needed to. At midnight Seoul Standard Time, every human channel in the galaxy went dark at once, and stayed that way. The first 3 days were, by unanimous later agreement, the calm before anyone understood there was a storm. The Council's standard response to any diplomatic rupture was a formal démarche, a strongly worded letter demanding clarification, sent through the usual channels. This time, the usual channels did not exist. There was no embassy to deliver a letter to. Ships dispatched toward Seoul space found the border checkpoints, small automated stations that had, for 3 decades, waved council traffic through with cheerful efficiency. Now silent, and, when approached too closely, politely but unambiguously firing warning shots that landed close enough to be taken seriously and far enough away to avoid being an act of war. No hail was answered. No transponder replied. The message, insofar as there was one, seemed to be, "We are not answering, and we are not interested in discussing why." Species that had trade relationships with human colonies discovered, over those 3 days, exactly how much of their supply chain had quietly come to depend on things nobody had bothered to track because they had always simply worked. A shipping consortium on Threnvale Station realized its entire fleet of automated cargo haulers ran on navigation software written by a small human firm that had never bothered registering a council-recognized patent, because the council had never bothered recognizing human software patents as equal to anyone else's, and the firm's support contracts terminated automatically the moment its parent company's communications went dark. The consortium's ships kept flying. Nobody could update them, patch them, or diagnose the increasingly strange errors that began appearing in their logs within a week. A medical research collective on 3 Worlds discovered that a broad-spectrum treatment protocol they had been quietly licensing from human researchers for the better part of a decade, one that had cut infant mortality rates from a wasting sickness common to low-gravity worlds by nearly 60%, had an expiration clause nobody had read closely, because nobody had imagined it would ever matter. The license required annual renewal digitally signed by a human institution. No renewal request could be sent. No signature could be obtained. The clock on the current license had 11 months left to run, and for the first time since the treatment was introduced, hospital administrators on 3 Worlds began quietly stockpiling the doses they already had. None of this alone would have caused panic. What caused panic, starting on day 4, was the realization that nobody could say with any confidence how deep it went, because nobody had ever mapped it. Humanity had spent 31 years being treated as a junior partner, seated last, consulted rarely, and in that time it had also, almost without anyone noticing, become quietly load-bearing in 100 small places nobody had thought to inventory. Not through conquest, not through any grand strategy, just through the ordinary, patient work of a species that kept showing up, kept fixing things, kept writing the software and running the trial and shipping the grain and telling the story that someone somewhere turned out to need. The Council Steering Committee convened an emergency closed session on day 5. The recording of that session was never officially released, but enough delegates leaked their own notes afterward that a rough picture emerged. A room full of representatives from the galaxy's oldest and most powerful species, none of whom had voted for war, none of whom wanted one, all of whom were suddenly and urgently trying to answer a question they had never seriously asked before. What exactly did humanity actually want? And was it too late to give it to them? 3B. Not everything that went quiet was a system or a supply chain. Some of it was smaller and stranger, and harder for anyone in a council briefing to put into a report. On a coastal city built into the cliffs of a world called Asa Prime, there was a theater that had, for 6 years, run nothing but human plays, translated, restaged, reimagined by a local company that had fallen in love with the strange, unresolved way human stories tended to end, the way they let grief sit on stage without rushing to explain it away. The company's founder, a performer named Vesa Andrine, had built her entire career on that borrowed tradition. And on day 3 of the silence, she discovered that the licensing service she used to legally stage each new script had gone dark along with everything else. She was not, technically, breaking any law by continuing to perform the plays already in her repertoire. Ownership of a script already staged didn't simply evaporate. What she couldn't do was get anything new. The playwright collective she'd corresponded with for years, the one that sent her early drafts and let her workshop them with her cast before anyone else in the galaxy had read them, stopped answering. Her next production, already half-cast, half-built, was supposed to open in 6 weeks. She had no ending for it. The script had been due to arrive from a writer she'd never met in person, a woman on a colony called New Providence, who signed her messages only with a first initial and a small line of punctuation Vesa had come to think of, fondly, as a kind of signature. She kept the production running anyway, in the end, by doing something her human collaborators would probably have found very funny. She asked her cast to finish it themselves, together, in the human style she'd spent 6 years learning secondhand, refusing tidy resolution, trusting the audience to sit with an ending that didn't explain itself. It was not what the absent playwright would have written. It opened on schedule anyway, to a full house that had followed the company's work for years and had, without quite realizing it, absorbed enough of that same unresolved, patient storytelling to meet the cast halfway. Afterward, several critics on Asa Prime wrote, with a kind of surprised affection, that the production felt like watching a language survive its native speaker leaving the room. Vessa read the reviews and cried, a little, in the way she suspected the plays she loved had taught her to. She sent a copy of the reviews to New Providence anyway, on the off chance the message might sit in a queue somewhere until the channels reopened. Months later, after they finally did, she got a reply, not a complaint about the unauthorized ending, but 3 words that she kept, afterward, taped above her desk. That's the idea. Kes Ambriner had never been anyone important, which was, until recently, exactly how she liked it. She was a structural engineer, second class, on a habitat ring orbiting a gas giant nobody outside her own trade guild could pronounce correctly. And for the past 9 years, her working relationship with humanity had consisted entirely of a forum. It was not an official forum. It had no council sanction, no corporate backing, no formal name beyond the one its regulars used, which translated roughly to the shop. It existed on a human-hosted server that had, as far as Kes could tell, been running continuously since before she joined it, moderated by a rotating cast of volunteers who mostly seemed to be retired engineers with strong opinions and stronger coffee habits. Anyone could post a problem. Anyone could answer. The humans who answered, and it was mostly humans, though plenty of other species posted too, had a way of explaining things that Kes had never encountered anywhere in her council-accredited training. Patient without being condescending, detailed without being obscure, and consistently, almost suspiciously willing to just tell you the thing you needed to know, instead of making you pay a licensing fee to find out. Her habitat ring's atmospheric processors ran on a control system that had been jointly designed a decade ago by a council contractor and a small human engineering cooperative that had long since been quietly frozen out of the follow-up contracts. The documentation Kes had access to covered maybe 60% of what the system actually did. The other 40% lived in her memory of forum threads, in screenshots she'd saved of a particular user's explanations, in a set of habits she'd learned from people she had never met and would probably never meet, on a planet she had never seen. On day 6 of the silence, the ring's secondary coolant loop began throwing an error Kes had never seen before. She went to the forum out of 11 years of pure reflex before she remembered. The page loaded. The old threads were still there, an archive frozen in time. But the posting window was gone, replaced with a single line of text in the plain, an ornamented font the site had always used. We're not going anywhere, but we're not here for a while. Take care of each other. The mods. No new posts. No new answers. Just a decade of accumulated knowledge sitting there, unreachable in any way that let you ask it a new question. Kes spent the next 6 hours doing what humans had taught her over 9 years of threads to do herself, reading old logs, comparing symptoms, working the problem instead of waiting for someone else to solve it for her. She fixed the coolant loop around hour 5, using a diagnostic technique she was fairly sure she'd learned 3 years earlier from a post by someone whose username was a pun she'd never quite understood. It worked. She sat back in the humming quiet of the control room afterward and found she was furious, not at the humans who owed her nothing, but at every council session she had never attended and never cared about, every regulation that had apparently been quietly strangling a system that had helped her keep several thousand people breathing, without her ever once being told it was happening. She filed a formal complaint with her Habitat administration that afternoon, the first one she'd filed in her career. It asked, in careful bureaucratic language, exactly what the council had done to make the people who taught her engineering disappear, and exactly what the administration intended to do about it. She was not the only one filing. Not every reaction to the silence was grief. Some of it, in certain rooms, was closer to opportunity. Admiral Threx Caladine of the Vantiri Compact had spent the better part of 2 decades arguing, quietly and without much success, that humanity's technological restraint was a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, and that a species this adaptable, left unsupervised for long enough, eventually stopped being a junior partner and started being a rival. He had never been popular for saying so. He was considerably more popular for it now. Within a week of the silence, Caladine had assembled a coalition of border-adjacent systems willing to fund what he carefully termed a readiness posture along the edge of human space. A fleet buildup that was not, he insisted in every public statement, a prelude to invasion, but simple prudence in the face of an unknown. Nobody could say what humanity was doing behind its new wall of silence. Nobody could say whether the withdrawal was the opening move of something larger. In the absence of information, Kaladine argued, the responsible thing was to prepare for the worst version of events, and preparing for the worst version of events required ships. It might have worked, if not for the fact that half the systems he was recruiting were the same ones currently discovering how much of their infrastructure had a human-shaped hole in it. The meeting where it fell apart happened 11 days into the silence, in a chamber the Compact used for sensitive briefings, and it was not Kaladine who dominated it. It was a trade minister from a mid-sized system called Orinth, a soft, unmilitary woman named Sail Dorith, who had spent the previous week fielding calls from every industry in her system about supply chains that had quietly stopped working, and who stood up in the middle of Kaladine's presentation to ask a question that landed harder than anyone expected. You want to build warships pointed at the one direction we currently have zero visibility into, she said, using shipyards that 3 of my engineers just told me this morning run diagnostic software none of us can currently patch or verify, because the people who wrote it are the same people we'd be pointing the warships at. Admiral, I would like to understand how, exactly, that plan survives contact with itself. Kaladine did not have a good answer. Nobody in the room did. The meeting adjourned without a resolution, and the fleet buildup continued in smaller, quieter form, but the coalition Kaladine had hoped for never fully materialized, because too many of the systems he needed were too busy discovering their own dependence to commit resources to a fight nobody could explain the purpose of. VB. Nobody on the Council side could see what was happening inside human space, which was, in its own way, the entire point. But the silence looked very different from the inside. There was no secret war council. There was no fleet massing behind Sol's border, whatever Admiral Kaladine chose to assume. What there was mostly was an unusually large number of very ordinary meetings held in unglamorous rooms by people who had spent 31 years being told their opinions were welcome but not weighted. Aisha Idowu spent the first week of the silence the way she'd spent most of the previous decade, in meetings. The difference was that these meetings no longer had a council observer sitting quietly in the back corner, taking notes for a report nobody would read closely enough to change anything. She sat with colony administrators from 11 worlds, with trade representatives who had spent years watching human goods get taxed as developmental, with engineers whose work had been treated for a decade as too primitive to matter and too useful to be allowed to spread freely. She asked them all the same question, more or less. What do you actually want? Now that nobody outside this room gets a vote on the answer. The answer surprised nobody who had been paying attention, and apparently startled everyone who hadn't. People wanted, overwhelmingly, less than the Council had always assumed. They did not want to conquer anything. They did not want a bigger seat at a table they'd already spent 3 decades resenting. Mostly they wanted to be left alone long enough to find out what they could build without asking permission first. And they wanted, if they ever did go back to that table, to go back because someone had actually asked them to, not because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. A colony administrator from the outer settlement of Keplerloid put it more bluntly than most, in a session Aisha would remember for years afterward. We spent 30 years proving ourselves to people who never intended to be convinced, the woman said. I don't want to prove anything anymore. I want to build the reactor my engineers have been begging to build for 6 years, the one the Council capped, because it made 3 species nervous. I want to build it and see if it works. If it doesn't, that's ours to fix. If it does, that's ours too. It was not a declaration of independence, exactly, because there was nothing to declare independence from anymore. It was simpler than that, a decision repeated in room after room across 11 colonies, to spend a while just being a species instead of being a case study. By the second week, the story that would later circulate, that humanity had gone dark to prepare for war, had become almost funny to the people actually living through it, because so much of what they were doing looked, from the inside, like the least warlike thing imaginable. Shipyards that had spent a decade building Council-compliant civilian freighters kept building civilian freighters, just without the compliance paperwork, slowing every design change down by 8 months. Research labs kept researching. A children's choir on Mars performed its scheduled spring concert, Entirely unaware that 3-star systems away, a trade minister was standing in front of an admiral explaining why his war fleet was a bad idea using, of all things, a coolant loop. What did change, quietly and almost without anyone deciding it on purpose, was a certain tension people hadn't fully noticed they were carrying. Diplomats stopped rehearsing statements 3 times before sending them, because there was no longer an audience whose approval mattered more than the truth of what they meant to say. Engineers stopped filing the extra paperwork that had never once, in 3 decades, actually prevented a single accident, only slowed down the fixing of one. It did not feel like triumph. Mostly, several people said afterward, it felt like finally being able to breathe out. The person who eventually broke the silence was not a council official, and was not, strictly speaking, authorized to do anything at all. Jonas would have been a lower-tier trade liaison, the kind of job that mostly involved paperwork nobody important read, based out of a small human consulate on a neutral trade station that existed specifically because it was owned by no one's government and therefore convenient for everyone's. When the withdrawal order came down, most human personnel had been recalled within 72 hours, quietly, without announcement, folded back into ships that left without fanfare and without goodbyes to the people they'd worked alongside for years. Jonas had asked for and been granted permission to stay 1 extra week to close out the consulate's affairs. He'd spent most of that week doing exactly that, returning equipment, filing final reports, having quiet, awkward, genuinely sad conversations with alien colleagues who kept asking him questions he had no authority to answer, and, increasingly, no desire to dodge. One of those colleagues was a Vantiri logistics officer named Farron Kessadjacent, no relation to the engineer on the gas habitat, a coincidence Jonas found mildly funny in a week that had given him very little to laugh at, who had worked 2 desks down from Jonas for 4 years and had, in that time, become something close to a friend, in the particular low-key way that happens between people who mostly talk about shipping manifests and occasionally, late in the evening, about everything else. On his last night before recall, over the last 2 bottles of decent whiskey Jonas owned, Farron asked him the question everyone across the galaxy was asking, in one form or another, and that nobody with actual authority had yet managed to get answered. Is it war? Jonas thought about it longer than the whiskey really warranted. No, he said finally. It's not war. I don't think anybody back home even wants to hurt you. I think, he turned the glass in his hand, I think he just got tired of being told to sit at the kids' table by people who never once asked if we wanted to be there. 31 years, Farron. We asked for a seat and got given a corner. We asked why and got told to be patient. We didn't leave because we hate you. We left because staying stopped being worth what it cost. And what would make it worth it again? Jonas didn't have an official answer to that. He wasn't authorized to have one. But he'd spent 11 years in this job listening to people, and he gave Farron the honest, unofficial version anyway, because in 3 days he'd be gone and none of it would matter in any way that could get him in trouble. Being asked instead of managed. Being at the table instead of being reviewed by a subcommittee. I don't know if that's on offer. I don't think anyone at home is holding their breath waiting for it, either. Near as I can tell, people are doing fine without you all. That's sort of the point. We're not gone because we're weak without you. We left because we found out we weren't. Farron sat with that for a long moment, then did something that was, for a Vantiri officer of his rank, mildly unorthodox. He wrote it down, word for word, on his personal terminal, and the next morning, instead of filing it with his chain of command as a low-priority personal log, he sent it directly and without permission to his cousin, who happened to work as a junior aide to a moderate delegate on the council's steering committee. The delegate read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, out loud, to the closed session that convened that same afternoon, and for the first time in 11 days, the room stopped talking about fleets and tariffs and started, instead, actually discussing the question underneath all of it. The council did not reverse the cultural standards ruling out of guilt. Guilt was not a currency the assembly traded in comfortably, and nobody in that chamber wanted to be the delegate whose formal statement admitted the older species had spent 3 decades quietly humiliating a partner. It reversed a ruling, and then a great many others alongside it, because 11 days of silence had made an argument no speech ever could. The galaxy needed humanity considerably more than the paperwork had ever admitted, and continuing to pretend otherwise was going to cost everyone far more than any subcommittee had bargained for. The vote to fully repeal the Category 2 designation passed on Day 19 unanimously, which surprised nobody who understood that unanimous votes usually meant the outcome had never really been in doubt, only the timing. What came next was harder, because it required something the Council had never previously had to do, reaching out to a species that was not, this time, waiting eagerly by the door. The formal request for renewed contact went out through every channel the Council could still reach: the neutral trade stations, the handful of independent shipping lines that still occasionally touched human ports, even, in one case that made several delegates visibly uncomfortable, a message physically carried by Kessambriner's Habitat Administration, forwarded along a chain of contacts that traced, eventually, and almost by accident, back to a moderator of a forum that had gone quiet. 19 days earlier. The reply, when it finally came, arrived 31 days after the silence began, the same number several people noted, as the years humanity had spent as a member, and it was not sent by a Council-recognized ambassador, because humanity did not currently have one to send. It was sent by Aisha Idowu, still officially retired from diplomatic service, addressed to the full assembly, and it was, once again, short. It said that humanity had spent the last month doing what it did best: fixing the things immediately in front of it, taking care of the people immediately around it, and discovering, in the process, that it did not particularly miss being managed. It said the offer to reverse the cultural ruling was appreciated, but on its own insufficient, that humanity was not interested in returning to a relationship built on the Council, occasionally remembering to apologize after the cost of not apologizing became too high. It said that if the Council wanted humanity back at the table, it would need to be an actual table, with an actual chair, and an actual willingness to be told no sometimes by a species the Council had spent 3 decades assuming would always eventually say yes. It did not say humanity would never return. It said the terms were open for discussion whenever the Council was ready to discuss them as equals rather than as guardians, and that in the meantime, humanity was doing fine, better, in some ways, than it had been doing while trying to earn a seat it should never have had to earn in the first place. She signed it, simply, as a private citizen, on behalf of no one but herself. 7b. The Council took 4 months to agree on how to answer a letter from a private citizen who represented no one but happened to be the only person humanity seemed willing to talk to, which told its own story about how little anyone had actually learned yet. When the delegation finally assembled, 6 Council representatives, chosen after a fight over selection criteria that ran longer than the letter itself had taken to write, it did not travel to Seoul. Seoul did not offer a venue, and nobody suggested one. Instead, the first face-to-face session in over 4 months took place on the same neutral trade station where Jonas would had once shared his last bottle of whiskey with a Vanturi logistics officer, in a chamber that belonged to no government at all. Aisha Idowu arrived with 2 colleagues and no formal title. She had been asked repeatedly to accept reinstatement as ambassador before the talks began, and had repeatedly declined, on the grounds that showing up as an ambassador implied there was still an embassy to represent, and there wasn't one, not yet, not until both sides agreed what it would actually be for. The first session did not go well, by most measures. The senior Council representative, a delegate named Orvash Teal who had spent his career on the old steering committee and had voted, without much thought, for nearly every restriction humanity had spent 3 decades absorbing, opened by proposing what he clearly believed was a generous gesture: full reinstatement of the Category 2 designation's privileges, effective immediately, with a formal apology for the cultural standards ruling specifically. Aisha let him finish. Then she asked him a single question that Jonas, watching the recording months later from a very different job, would describe as the moment the entire negotiation actually began. Category 2 of what? Till didn't have a ready answer. The designation had existed so long that nobody currently serving could fully explain what it was meant to measure, only that it had always applied to humanity and had never applied to anyone the Council considered a peer. "We are not interested in being reinstated into a category," Aisha said. We're interested in whether the council is capable of treating a partner as a partner instead of a project. If the answer is yes, we can talk about what a relationship built on that actually looks like. If the answer is still no, dressed up more politely than before, we'd rather keep doing what we've been doing for the last 4 months, which is fine, by the way. Better than fine. So take your time deciding. We're not in a hurry anymore. It was not the opening TL had prepared for, and the session adjourned early, tense and unresolved. It took 3 more sessions, spread across another 2 months, before the council brought a proposal that did not use the word category anywhere in it. A bilateral framework, negotiated point by point rather than imposed by subcommittee, with review authority split evenly rather than held entirely on one side. It was not perfect. Aisha's team spent an entire session simply arguing over what evenly meant in practice, and won most of that argument by the simple, patient tactic of refusing to move the meeting forward until the language actually said what it claimed to say. But it was, for the first time in 31 years, a document written by 2 parties who both had somewhere else they could afford to be if it fell through. That fact alone changed the tone of every sentence in it. The negotiations that followed took the better part of a year, and they were, by every account that eventually leaked, considerably less comfortable for the council than any session in its recent history, because for the first time in 3 decades, humanity walked into the room with nothing to prove and nothing it particularly needed, and negotiated accordingly. Kes Ambriner was not in that room. She had no reason to be. She was an engineer, not a diplomat, and the largest political act of her life so far had been a single strongly worded complaint filed to a Habitat administration that had, to her genuine surprise, actually read it. But 6 months after the silence began, on the day the forum's posting window quietly reopened, no announcement, no fanfare, just the interface working again one ordinary morning, exactly the way it always had. She was the first person on her ring to notice, and she sat at her console for a long moment before typing anything at all. She wrote a post, in the end, that had nothing to do with coolant loops. It said thank you plainly for 9 years of patient answers from people who had never had to give them and had given them anyway, and that she was sorry it had taken a galaxy nearly falling apart for her to say so out loud. The reply came within the hour from a username she recognized, the one whose pun she still didn't quite understand. Don't thank us for coming back, it read. Thank the people who made it worth staying gone. We noticed. That's why we're here. Below it, over the following days, dozens of other users added their own replies. Human and otherwise, engineers and strangers, people who had spent a silent month discovering exactly how much they'd built together without ever quite noticing they were building it. Until the thread became, without anyone planning it, less a technical forum post and more a record of a galaxy that had learned, the hard way, what it actually meant to have someone worth keeping, and what it cost to almost lose them by never once asking if they wanted to stay. The council never fully forgot the lesson, though it came close, more than once, in the decades after. But every time it did, someone in the assembly, usually someone who had lived through those 31 silent days, who remembered exactly how fast 100 small, ordinary dependencies could turn into a single unbearable absence, would stand up, quietly, and remind the room what the silence had actually cost, and what it had, in the end, taught them to fix. It was never the fleets that brought humanity back to the table. It was the small things nobody had thought to count, until, for 31 days, they were gone. The new agreement was signed quietly, on a date that was chosen for no symbolic reason at all. The negotiators simply happened to finish on it, which several people later agreed was oddly fitting for a document that had spent months insisting it wanted to be ordinary rather than historic. There was no grand ceremony. Aisha Idu did accept the ambassador's title again, eventually, once there was finally something worth representing, though she made a point, in her first address to the reconvened assembly, of noting that the brass nameplate could stay off the door a while longer. Some habits, she said, were worth keeping, even after the reason for them had changed. Kes Ambriner never met her, or Jonas, or Vesa, or any of the other people whose ordinary, unglamorous choices had quietly added up to something none of them could have engineered on purpose. She went back to fixing coolant loops, mostly, though she kept an eye on the forum in a way she hadn't before, and she was the one a year later who welcomed a nervous new poster, an alien engineer from a system that had only just gained full trade access to human technical archives. With the same patience, she'd once been shown by a stranger whose username was a pun she still didn't understand. Farron Kessadjacent got a quiet commendation he never fully explained to his superiors, and a standing invitation, once travel resumed, to visit the consulate desk, where he'd once shared whiskey with a friend he'd assumed he'd never see again. Jonas took him up on the offer within the year, and the two of them spent an evening doing what they always had, talking about shipping manifests, and then, late, about everything else. The council kept the lesson longer than institutions usually keep anything, mostly because the cost of forgetting it had been so specific and so widely felt that nobody who lived through it wanted to explain, a second time, why a habitat's coolant loop, or a colony's medicine, or a small theater's unfinished play had all gone quiet on the same ordinary Tuesday. Historians eventually gave the 31 days a name, though the name never quite agreed on itself. Some called it the withdrawal, some the silence, and a smaller, more honest faction called it simply the inventory. The one time the galaxy had been forced all at once to count every ordinary thing it had never thought to value until it vanished. Nobody who was there ever needed the name explained.